Excellent. I think we're good to get started. If I can just get an acknowledgement in the stage, I see some comments coming in, but if I could just get a general thumb up, well, I guess I can't do a thumbs up, but you can type a thumbs up in the stage. I would be super happy to know that we're good to go. It is a good shirt, right? Okay, so it looks like, hey Kojo, hey Ali. All right, awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started because I know time is precious and everyone is, I can imagine, it's been, from everything I've seen online, the range of talks, PyCon Africa, you all are fantastic. So I wanted to first start by saying thank you so much to the organizing team of PyCon Africa for inviting me to participate in PyCon Africa 2020. I know that running a virtual conference is no easy feat. So huge, huge, huge thank you and a round of applause to our organizing team. And on that note, I just really can't even begin to it's been 1 year since PyCon Africa 2019. And when I was asked if I wanted to participate in this year's conference to share a talk, it really started opening up a year. I started kind of looking at this year and taking some time to think a little bit about reflection. So what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is going to be looking at building Python community in the here and now, particularly in the year 2020. So the title of this talk is Together But Apart, Building Python Community in 2020. So last weekend, the speakers of PyCon Africa were invited to participate in a virtual social. Speakers from North America, South America, Africa, and more were present in this call. All of us were there together, sharing our joy of this lovely programming language, which you may know the name of, this little programming language that we call Python. Yes, I do have a Python plush. So, it wasn't strange to see everyone in the virtual hangout, so much as it was strange to think about how it was that we were all sharing this moment in 2020. 2020, the year of social distancing, where the social norm means isolating ourselves and practicing 6 feet of distancing measures. 2020, where I'm pretty sure today is now March day 161. I double checked that because there's this great website called eternalmarch.com and it tells you what day of March it is. 2020, where the sense of time is just so warped. The thing, however, that didn't feel strange during our speaker chat was some of the discussions we were having. And one of the things that we were talking about on that call was food. And let's be real, I think that's something that all of us can connect to. I'm a really, really, really big food person. Talking about peppered snails, fufu, jollof, cassava, smoked fish. Some of these dishes were discussed in our virtual hangout. And as food is something that's universal and something beloved by all, that was actually something in our conversation that made me feel like, okay, yes, 2020 is a bit weird, but it's still the same. We may be apart, but we're still together, just in a different way. Actually, I couldn't help but find myself laughing when the topic did turn to jollof, since it was actually at PyCon Africa 2019 that I was schooled in this infamous Nigeria versus Ghana jollof feud. I kept getting asked to decide which of the two I found better. However, as a smart food lover and as someone who has been taught well by my abuela to never offend anyone's cooking, I basically said, I'm neutral. I need to continue to eat more to figure it out. Also, it's a really great way to get more food if you're always a little bit in the neutral space. So why say no when you can enjoy them all? There was, actually there's a lot of commonalities in West African food, in some of the food that I found that I've enjoyed growing up. See, in the Caribbean and the nations with populations of West African origin, such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Puerto Rico, plantains or yams are often mashed and then other ingredients are added to a dish. In the Dominican Republic, the dish is known as mango, whereas in Puerto Rico and in Cuba, this dish is often known as mofongo. The difference between West African fufu and Caribbean fufu is noted both in the texture and the flavorings. Caribbean fufu and mofongo being less of a dough-like and more of a food that has a firm consistency. Another difference that can be seen in mofongo, unlike Caribbean fufu and West African fufu, is that Puerto Rican mofongo is fried, then mashed with broth and olive oil. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about food and why I'm spending so much time talking about such things as mofongo or fufu. And this actually kind of comes back to a bit about who I am and where I'm from. See, I'm a Pythonista that hails from a stellar city known as Chicago, home of the first skyscraper, the home insurance building built in 1884, the first Ferris wheel, and the creators of the deep dish, which I'm sorry to tell you, any true Chicagoan will inform you that no, we do not eat deep dish. I think that's just like a tourist thing. But the thing about Chicago that I love so much, and specifically when I talk about Chicago, I grew up in this neighborhood called Humboldt Park. And actually, these are some photos I took just of running 2 days ago from Humboldt Park, where, as you can see in the image on the left-hand side, this is a neighborhood that is infamous for the Puerto Rican flags marking division, which is also locally known as Paseo Boricua. Have you ever, if you're ever looking for finding food such as mofongo or other great Cuban Puerto Rican delicacies, Humboldt Park's going to be a place you're going to want to go. As a child of Cuban and Mexican parents, the flavors of spice, plantain, manioc, these are all flavors that I know that are punched into the dishes that I love. These are things that actually are a cornerstone of my taste palette. You know, another thing that I thought that was super interesting in hearing the discussion about food, and it did actually come up again in the speaker hangout last weekend, was to hear the takes that Africans have amongst other African cuisines, particularly hearing how some folks that aren't from West Africa saying that, you know, West African food is just too spicy. See, for me, I very much enjoy the spicy element in West African food. I think it is quite excellent. I tend to cook, you know, with a few jalapenos, habaneros, and all the chiles. I do love those chili peppers. Very much for me, I love spice both in terms of heat index and just the actual spice variant itself. So these commonalities in foods are not lost on me. So hi, my name's Lorena Mesa. So before I digress too much into food, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I do a few things in technology, including helping organize PyLadies Chicago. I am the Python Software Foundation chairperson and a director. I also work at GitHub, and I'm a huge proponent of responsible technology. You can find me on most places in the web as Lorena Nicole, and yes, that is L, 4 O's to begin, and then the 5th O in the Nicole. I'm always very happy to chat. And as perhaps what I may describe myself as a Python mega fan, I have been fortunate enough to be able to travel to participate in many of the global Python events around the world, including PyCon Africa 2019. Actually, when I was speaking with Marlene last year about a trip I had planned going to Nigeria for a friend's birthday, it was Marlene who pointed out that it's only an hour flight from Lagos to Accra, and that I really ought to make the effort to attend the inaugural PyCon Africa 2019. And I'm so thankful that I did. One of the largest themes that I took away from PyCon Africa 2019 focused on the interconnectivity of us all, how our community is a broader representation of the subset of relationships that we as people have with one another. In 2019, Keynote Kojo, who's here in the chat today, really, I found that message talking about his lived experience as a Black man from the United States returning to Africa during the year of return, a symbolic 400-year anniversary, talking about diaspora and the movement of peoples, to be very, very compelling and something that helps set the stage in thinking about what was going to be the cornerstone of PyCon Africa. Additionally, another speaker, Felipe, a Pythonista from Brazil, continued this dialogue around homecoming, this dialogue about identity, this dialogue about diaspora, highlighting the role of African identity and building community in Brazil, specifically for Afro-Brazilians in his work with Afro-Python, a Python community specifically for Afro-Pythonistas. The theme of homecoming and connectivity, all of this has invited, I think, within me a lot of reflection. The lessons from PyCon Africa 2019 stay strong and top of mind for me, particularly as we navigate the world that we live in. As many of you are aware, another worldwide movement has taken hold throughout 2020. No longer is it that we're just living in a pandemic, but we're also living through the reawakening of what it means to talk about equity in the here and now. Of those issues around equity, racial equity is at the forefront of that movement. It's really impossible for us to ignore. In fact, this is actually a mural that was taken in my neighborhood just around the corner, prominently saying, all in this together. This dialogue, this narrative of what it means to be separated but together, of having these worldwide movements, of really trying to reflect and apply learnings to help us navigate the current moment and build a better future. These are all things that are very top of mind for me. And actually, I felt very much were the cornerstone of some of the things that I saw present at PyCon Africa 2019. So alongside this worldwide dialogue and moment, I can't help but also just point out that even within the space of Chicago, where I talk about, how we talk about food and the connectivity of people through food, within Chicago, we're having our own hyper-local discussion of what it means to build community. Chicago, if you ever were to look up the landscape of Chicago and how Chicago has evolved over time, it is very difficult not to notice the pronounced segregation within the city. In fact, Chicago over the last 40 years has had a few trends that are not unique to just Chicago, but is definitely something that I think we see in many urban spaces, and actually in many spaces around the world. The wealthier getting wealthier, the erasure of middle class, hypertension kind of between those that have and those that do not have. Again, the idea of what it means to live in Chicago is a city of more than one tale. In fact, it's a city of very fundamentally divergent tales. Looking at this map of the Chicago landscape, what you can see is that there is quite a pronounced racial breakdown of Chicago, with the northwest sides having more of the white population, the south side having more of the Black population, and then the what I identify as Latinx, or is commonly referred to as Hispanic, being in other pockets along the southwest and northwest sides. See, my work as a technologist began not as someone in computer science, but actually as someone who's very, very intrigued and interested in what it means to build community and how we build community better together. My roots actually come back from starting my work as someone in political science, a not yet very widely known individual, then Senator Barack Obama, had kicked off a campaign, which I actually ended up working on. The message of that campaign, Change We Can Believe In, was something that is highly empowering and something that I think really speaks to the core values and identities that I have. So in the work from working on thinking about how we can use political spaces to build better community, to then actually working in the hyperlocal space of Chicago, one of the other areas that I found myself working was actually looking at policing technologies in Chicago. Chicago, given that we understand it has this duality, this idea that the experience of one person can be fundamentally different than another person, and that can have a very real reflection on the identity of who that person is based on where they live. This can also be seen in policing patterns in Chicago. In fact, this whole idea of like how to police and what does policing look like, one of the strategies that has often been dialogued about in Chicago has been the idea of predictive policing. That is, using technology and strategies informed by technology to quote unquote be smarter and do things better. Of some predictive policing strategies suggested, some of them indicated trying to come up with strategies where you can identify potential offenders before they actually offend. What exactly that means, I don't know, but the presumption is that the details in the data can help us come up with these ideas of how we can do predictive analytics. However, as we've seen in this moment, and as we talk about these things, there's a lot of bias in that work, and what that actually means can be very much informed by variances in one's socioeconomic background, variances in one's identity, variances of many things that you were born into and are a broader systemic power structure. So the movement from thinking about how to build community with a very positive spin of a political campaign to moving into understanding how in my backyard, the hyperlocal is very important when it talks about how we build community, and thinking about how it is we have harm mitigation rather than increasing harm through policing. It was a bit inevitable that I found myself taking a bit more and more steps into doing work that was questioning why some of these strategies were being used in Chicago, and how it is that we have come to accept that certain technology answers that are used to not build community but break community down are actually the techniques and tools that we use. Particularly in Chicago, there was a dialogue that kicked off again in 2018 when looking at the disappearances of peoples within the Chicago Police Department, overwhelmingly these peoples being people of color, and how it was that their legal rights weren't being upheld, how it was that these people were essentially being disappeared within the system, and why that was okay. Asking questions and actually then using my technical skill set alongside many others in a few civic tech projects in Chicago. Again, when you ask the right questions and you think about harm mitigation and you think about how it is we build community better together, there's definitely a space for technology to help us in that pursuit of better equity. So the dialogue around predictive policing is not one that's only unique to Chicago. There has been a lot of dialogue about policing within the space of the United States of America. There's been a lot of that from larger tech organizations such as Amazon and their recognition product, and what it means to use facial recognition in predictive policing. Just because we can, do we use these strategies? Are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking of that if the tech we build is not actually including the community that it's supposed to protect and empower, do these technology tools actually allow us to do what we need to? Or instead, is it increasing bias and promoting inequity? The really big struggle for me came when I found that actually a piece of technology I was working on in 2018 for a social media management software firm that I worked for was actually being sold to the Chicago Police Department. And that piece of technology, unfortunately, was being used in such a way as to encourage policing patterns to continue to be responsive, to continue to promote harm rather than thinking about restorative measures. Specifically, the organization I had worked for, a group that resold us, was named in a lawsuit brought by the ACLU, a group within the United States of America that is kind of a watchdog, someone who observes to make sure that the fundamental rights of folks living within the United States of America aren't violated. So that journey of thinking about community building and knowing that community building is something that has always been a driving part of the work that I do, really came full circle from the time of 2009 I graduated university to the time of 2018, where I was actually finding myself being at the heart of a conversation where the technology I was building wasn't building better communities, but instead was encouraging the continued harm of others and was not actually taking a critical lens and thinking about how we influence the world around us. I often point to this image in talking about what accountability means for us as individual technologists, but also for us in technology itself with one another. Mark Zuckerberg here being seated in front of the United States Senate Intelligence Committee was being asked basically about his sense of accountability for Facebook's conduct during the 2016 United States of America's presidential elections. And really, this right here, this moment, I think is a moment where many of us can see the look here of someone who perhaps is maybe getting it or maybe is not. But instead of saying that it's just Mark Zuckerberg, I like to encourage people to think about what happens if you're the person who's in that seat. So the current moment that we're navigating, the moment of social accountability from the perspective of making sure that we have responsible practices for how we interact with one another, for how it is we are educating ourselves and holding ourselves accountable from the work we do to how we work alongside others. There's many people who've done research in this field and have really, I think, been influential in helping me navigate some of this, from weapons of mass destruction, looking at Kathy O'Neill's work, highlighting how basically data practices and how the presumption of data as neutral in technology has been highly problematic and leads to us building tools that continue to bring harm into the world. Alongside the work of Dr. Safia Noble with algorithms of oppression, understanding kind of the way that even search engines and the way that users interact in search engines and how it is that we bake our own biases into how information is indexed and surfaced. These are very interesting ways to kind of think about accountability, because again, community building is not only just about thinking about the in-person experience, but it's also about the invisible influence and what happens when we don't talk about accountability. So another way that I think we can think about community building, or even just about accountability itself, is we can start thinking about, the Python community, specifically, equity, or what does equity mean in technology? If we're thinking about it from a community perspective, we can think about it as people who have different disciplines. So maybe folks who are full stack engineers, perhaps folks who are data scientists, folks who are computer science educators, or another way we can think about it as folks that belong within similar communities of belonging. So in this case, we're all folks that love Python. And one of the really interesting things about Python, and I'm sure is not at all lost to all of us, is that Python has been a place of rampant growth. From the Stack Overflow 2017 survey, basically it was seen that in 2017 alone, Python had grown 27%. Some of the reasons why we find that Python has been so successful in growing is many of the reasons why we love Python, and it has been the topics of many of the things here at PyCon Africa 2020, such as why Python is great. Well, it's easy to use. It's open source. It has really broad use cases, from scientific computing to web development to DevOps. Additionally, what has been interesting to observe within the Python community has been us having better understanding the ways in which people use Python. Each year there is a Python development survey that has been done. So from the 2018 JetBrains Python Developer Survey, some of the interesting trends we see within Python has been the continued upward trajectory of people using Python for data analysis as its primary use case. So 58% in this context from the 2018 survey, with 52% using Python primarily for web development. All of these things and us understanding who our community is and how it is we use Python allows us to have a very focused dialogue of how it is we can talk about better informed community building and have initiatives on the books. And one way that we do this has been through some of the work with the Python Software Foundation. So I find that when I speak about the Python Software Foundation, there are some people who know what it is and some people who do not. And I am here to tell you that is completely okay. If you're looking to learn more about the Python Software Foundation, you can go to python.org/PSF. And actually what the PSF is, it is an organization that is set up to oversee this specific mandate. The mission specifically here is to promote, protect, and advance the Python programming language, which should be no surprise, as well as to support and facilitate the growth of a diverse and international community of Python programmers. So when it comes to when it comes to not just what is the mission of the PSF, but really what is the entity of the PSF? The PSF is a nonprofit that is based in the United States of America that has the intellectual property rights behind Python, allowing us to keep it free and open for all to use, as well as also offering underwriting for sponsoring conferences, funding grants and special projects, and leading volunteer efforts. So when it comes to the PSF and when it comes to Python and the ways in which we can empower our community and think about the work that we do, it's really quite interestingly set up such that we're able to make sure that the range of activities that we are supporting and that we're putting on our roadmap can truly have a global impact. So if we're looking at the grants program alone as one example of this impact, from the 2019 annual report, which again, you can find at python.org. If you look at the PSF section, there's an annual report, which is published if you're ever curious. You can look at the grants program and see just the distribution of funds. What has been really interesting to see is the diversification of funds for activity around the world. So not just in North America, but in other parts of the world. As you can see here, 26% for Africa in 2019. Again, these grants go to support our community in a variety of ways, ranging from supporting meetup fees to helping fund developer sprints, be them in person or remote, because again, we're doing things from a remote lens, obviously, for the current moment, as well as helping fund events such as PyCons, which are fantastic opportunities. So when you think about, the way that the PSF can truly have, or rather the way that we as a community can have true kind of impact, one way we can think through that is through the lens of the Python Software Foundation. In terms of overall capital, what that looks like was in 2018, approximately $324,000 was gifted, in which that was about a 22.6% increase from 2017 alone. Obviously, right now, those numbers will be different as we think about building community in the here and now. And so when I ask us to think about building Python community in the here and now, it may not be that it's grants, but instead I'm going to encourage you to think about some other opportunities. So specifically, one of the things that has come up recently has been a dialogue around the Python Software Foundation Board of Directors election reform. Specifically, there was a dialogue opened at discuss.python.org in which some feedback was captured and a dialogue was kicked off to try to invite people to think about what would the broader Python community like to see when it comes to evolving the practices of the Python Software Foundation. Again, this staff and nonprofit founded and based in the United States has a voted on board of directors, of which I am a member and Marlene is a member. And if these folks are to represent the broader collective interests of the Python community, we want to make sure that we're doing this work well and doing it intentionally. Some of the things that were brought up in this dialogue ranged from regional representation to having term limits to thinking about what does it mean about the makeup of the board itself. Do we need to think about having different kind of balance checks in place? For example, if a certain population of folks are coming from the same employer, do we need to have something to safeguard against that? More specifically, one of the topics that came up was actually raised by a community member who had wrote this very, very detailed write-up called Diversification is the Future for the Python Software Foundation by Iqbal Abdullah, who's a Pythonista from the APAC community. And specifically, some of the things that were called out here looked at thinking about not just that the election itself ought to be something to have some safeguards in it, but instead to think about how it is where we can meet Pythonistas where they are at, meet them in their local community. The reason I shared some of the work I've done in Chicago is because, again, I think when it comes to accountability and it comes to impact, the hyperlocal is very important, as we are the experts in the communities in which we are most connected to and we're most involved in. Some of the things here highlighted included having a diversification of the Python Software Foundation membership base. And additionally, on the other side of this year's elections, Ernest, who's Director of Infrastructure for the Python Software Foundation, has this write-up specifically talking about some of the ways in which we can continue to do better work in making sure that we're fulfilling that mandate of the Python Software Foundation mission, explicitly to build a community that reflects the global diverse range of Pythonistas that we all love to work with, some of which have a short, medium, and long-term scope. So in the short term, thinking about improving membership profiles and demographic data. In the medium term, thinking about consolidating membership classes, as registering as a member sometimes can be a little complicated, people find, since there's a few options and people don't know exactly which one they ought to register for. And then lastly, just reconsidering membership itself and the benefits that come with it. There is a membership called a PSF Fellow, which, by the way, PSF Fellows are nominated from the broader community of Pythonistas. And I encourage you all, go check out python.org to read about the fellows. If there's someone that you think really exemplifies the spirit of Python, be it they are a big contributor to a Python open source product, they really are just someone who is doing a lot of Python community work or some blend in between, nominating that person as a PSF Fellow, if accepted, actually gets them a lifelong status as a voting member, hence the fellow. And I find that's actually a membership benefit that many people aren't aware of. So in thinking also about other ways in which we can continue to reform and better do this work of meeting our Pythonistas where they are at, beyond just saying that we have this community of belonging where we can reform membership around, if you're a supporting member, someone who pays an annual fee to vote, or someone who's a managing or contributing where you're doing some number of hours supporting Python open source or community, or you are a Python fellow. There's also then the idea of these other spaces for community of belonging. So I've referenced at the start of this talk how AfroPython is a unique community within Brazil, a space for Afro-Pythonistas. There is, as we may know, a group called PyLadies, a group for folks that identify as women that participate within the Python space. And up to now, being a member of PyLadies was not really something that had ever been codified. And there's been a lot of work in thinking about how we can bring PyLadies in more explicitly to make sure that there's a membership class there. So I'm excited to share that members.pyladies.com exists. We have a work in progress for the membership portal there, but if registering as a PyLadies member, it does actually get you a Python Software Foundation membership as well. And there's two opportunities. There's a basic and then there's a voting PyLadies, as PyLadies itself also now is moving towards having a global leadership model akin to the way that the Python Software Foundation or the core Python developers have a leadership group that is selected to help be the vanguard leading the mission. In fact, beyond just saying how we do some of this diversification of membership work, I do want to make an intentional plug here of saying when it comes to thinking about the work that we do with community building, PyLadies itself actually has an inaugural election that is happening that is open right now for calls for folks to sign up to participate in the election, or they can apply for a seat through a nomination process the election getting 2 years, the nomination process getting 1 year. But again, all this to say that within thinking about community building in Python and the broader Python community, we've got a lot of these conversations that are unfolding. And the part that is most instrumental in making this work happen is us coming together to talk about the work that needs to be done. So when I talk about Python community building in 2020, I really want to encourage people to think about having those conversations with your PSF directors, having those conversations within your hyperlocal community, or having those within other communities of belonging within the Python space that you identify with. That work begins with us, starts with us, and it ends with us. So I think as technologists, it's our duty to stay informed, and that means educating ourselves not only on bias in tech, but how tech impacts us all and how that impact can have a real negative or a real positive impact. I've actually started a reading list if anyone is curious about some of these broader issues called biasin.tech. That's an open GitHub repository. But on the more specific level, when it comes to community building and for Python 2020, this work is going to be happening in the virtual space. And so I think a lot of this is going to be happening in us thinking about how we approach the systemic foundations in which how we build community. So I really would love to continue to have this dialogue with you all. I have my calendar open for anyone who would like to have more of these dialogues at lorenamesa.com/about.html. And really, I would just love to hear, what does reform look like to you? So reform, maybe it's the membership opportunity. Maybe it is thinking about outreach. Maybe it's thinking about how we do more intentional outreach in the virtual space. There's a lot of this dialogue that is happening now. And I think since we're all in this really interesting and unique moment of 2020, many of us are very open to having that dialogue. And I have to say, it's because of communities like the one I met at PyCon Africa, where at the forefront of all the work I've seen with PyCon Africa, the vulnerability, the openness of talking about what it means to build community, how you need to be intentional, how you need to be not only intentional, but consistent and engage. I think that's the kind of model that inspires me to do the work that I do. So this snapshot from PyCon Africa 2019, I really love it. Everyone's just fantastic and all smiles. But I just want to say that the opportunity to be able to work alongside you all is second to none. And I'm so thankful to be able to share a little bit about the ways that I see Python community building work can happen in the here and now, and ways we can take steps to move forward together. So without further ado, I would just like to say, if anyone does have any questions, I would be super happy to take some now. Or because I understand this topic is a bit of a broader one and you would like to ruminate on it a little bit, please do feel free to reach out to me at lorenamesa.com. And again, my social on pretty much all corners of the internet, Lorena Nicole, with 4 O's at the start, because why not? Thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today. And with that, that's the end of my talk. Great, okay. So I'm just gonna hang out in the stage area, see if there's anyone who has questions. Thank you, I appreciate you all. That's a great question. You have a fantastic organizing team here. And I think that the organizing team here is a very, very proactive group. So I imagine that if you're looking for folks like Guido to come speak, they would be very open to that feedback. I know that event planning starts early, so maybe not right now, but maybe give them a few weeks or a few months, let's say it like that. But definitely, I know the outreach team is fantastic for the PyCon Africa group. Excellent. Okay, well, I don't think there's anyone that has any questions. So I definitely want to say thank you again, everyone, for allowing me the opportunity to talk a little bit about what community building I think looks like and how we've done such a great set of work here in our space. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to our fantastic PyCon Africa organizing team. And again, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. What do you think the PSF? Oh, actually, there is one question from Daniele. What do you think the PSF will look like in, say, 5 years' time after those efforts and initiatives? I believe that's a great question, Daniele. I think to me, I think what would be really, really interesting is one of the things that has come up a lot has been more movement and having more intentional spaces for regional kind of leadership spaces. So I imagine, I don't know if it's going to be a model like what we have with the European Python Society, but I imagine, for example, the grants work group. So for those of you who are curious about how some of the volunteer initiatives are done with the Python Software Foundation, we have work groups. You can read about them at python.org. And these are all volunteer driven. So for example, for our grants work group, what is really important is to make sure we have folks that are from all of the different regional areas that can provide us some context of how we evaluate what a grant looks like and how to best review a grant. And that it has basically regional requirements. So in making that group more effective, we've had to be more intentional about saying what expectations are for who ought to be participating in the conversation. So I think that idea is something that is kind of getting more and more traction as we think about more ways that we do this kind of this work within the Python community. So I don't know if it means that we're going to have maybe other European Python societies focus on the continent space, but with more of these regional continent-specific PyCons, I don't see why not. I actually think that leads to more hyper-local focus and empowerment. And I definitely think that's something I'm seeing people much more interested in. Additionally, I think the other thing to think about is, with Python Software Foundation, we are just one part of the broader Python space. So if there's people who have like more niche interests, maybe you're very interested in scientific Python only, or you're more specifically interested in core Python development, there's leadership models that exist in those spaces as well. So I would say if that is something you want to follow as well, definitely make sure you follow those conversations in those spaces. Great. Okay. And I think that is actually then the end of my session. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.